Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a sledgehammer to one of the most ingrained and maybe one of the most limiting ideas about work and what makes people tick.
We're talking about that central conflict that really defined the early 20th century factory floor.
Right. The belief that the singular lever you need to pull to get a worker to do more is cash.
That's it. That traditional view, it just dominated industrial thinking for decades. It basically sees workers as, interchangeable parts who only respond to financial incentives and very strict rules.
It's the whole philosophy behind what we now call scientific management.
Exactly, pioneered by Frederick Winslow Taylor. And Elton Mayo, the man we're talking about today, he had a great name for this philosophy. He called it the rabble hypothesis.
Rabble hypothesis. I love that term.
Yeah.
The idea that humanity is just this, disorganized horde of individuals.
Yeah, a horde all driven purely by self-interest and money.
It's a profoundly cynical way to look at people. But today, we are diving deep into the research of the man who spent his career just systematically dismantling that entire idea, George Elton Mayo.
And this is a deep dive specifically designed to show you why his research forced, and I mean forced, organizations to see that their workforce wasn't just a collection of cogs in a machine,
But a complex tapestry of human beings.
governed by emotion, by social belonging, and crucially, by group dynamics. Our sources today trace his whole path from, an obscure medical dropout to the progenitor of the entire human relations movement.
And what makes Mayo so fascinating, I think, is that he didn't approach this like an engineer, which was the standard back then. He came at it with this truly unique, almost clinical background.
That's such a critical point. Mayo's academic journey was, it was all over the place. He studied philosophy, psychology, psychopathology. He even started medical studies before dropping out.
So when he finally walked onto a factory floor, he didn't see an optimization problem for machinery.
No, not at all. He saw a potential psychological illness in the organization itself. He was looking for hidden symptoms, for emotional structures, for social friction, like a doctor trying to diagnose a very complicated patient.
Right. So instead of timing how long it took to tighten a screw, he was looking at the anxiety and the social fatigue of the person doing the tightening.
And that clinical approach, starting in the 1920s, it didn't just tweak management theory. It gave us the first really substantial, large-scale, systematic study showing how crucial the human factor is in production.
It's why we even have concepts like organizational culture and team morale today. I mean, if you want to understand why your boss is always talking about team building, you really have to go back and understand Elton Mayo.
It all starts with him.
So let's start the journey before the really famous stuff, before the lights went or off, I guess, at Hawthorne. We're going to begin in 1923 at a textile mill in Philadelphia. Mayo wasn't trying to change the world here.
No, not yet. He was just trying to solve a very specific, very localized, and profoundly expensive problem for one company.
Okay, so set the scene for us. What was this impossible problem they were facing?
Well, on paper, this factory was a model organization. Good facilities, decent pay. But one specific department, the mule spinning department, was just a complete disaster.
How bad was it?
The labor turnover there was astronomical. We're talking 250% per year.
250%. Wait, to put that in perspective for you, if you had 40 jobs in that department, you're hiring 100 new people every single year just to keep things running.
Imagine the chaos, the constant training, the lack of any real skill continuity. It was just hemorrhaging money and productivity.
Especially when the rest of the factory had a totally normal turnover rate of, 5 or 6%.
Exactly. And they had already tried everything the rabble hypothesis would tell you to do. They tried financial incentives, they tried punishing the slackers, they even replaced machinery. Nothing worked.
So the traditional levers, the mechanical and financial ones, they just completely failed.
Utterly. Management was pretty much ready to just conclude that the workers themselves were defective or lazy or just couldn't handle the monotony.
And that's where Mayo's clinical method becomes the big differentiator. He doesn't look at the payroll figures or the machine efficiency logs. He just spends time observing.
Yes, observing the environment, actually talking with the workers. And he found these two major hidden issues that the engineers had completely missed.
Well, where are they?
The first was purely physical, but it was often overlooked. Severe physical fatigue.
Okay.
These mule spinners had to walk a 30-yard alley constantly, back and forth, just watching their machines. And this continuous, repetitive walking led to chronic foot trouble and just profound exhaustion.
So they were just physically worn out, not just for work, but for their lives outside of work.
Precisely. And the second issue was You could call it a social poison. The noise and the sheer distance between the machines created this profound social isolation.
So even though they're in a room with dozens of other people.
They might as well be alone. The noise made communication, as the report says, almost difficult. You couldn't just chat or bond. They were isolated individuals stuck doing fatiguing, repetitive work.
And the boss didn't help, I take it?
Not at all. The supervisor was an old Army colonel, a very rigid military-style authority figure. The workers felt like there was no way they could ever approach him to complain about anything.
So the result wasn't just high turnover, it was actual psychological distress.
Yes, symptoms of melancholy. It was a deeply unhappy place.
Okay, so the diagnosis is chronic fatigue plus total social isolation. What was the first simple fix Mayo tried?
The initial intervention was incredibly simple: rest. They introduced 2 10-minute rest periods in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. Very simple, very cheap.
And the immediate results were pretty dramatic, right?
They were stunning. I mean, production went up, of course, because the physical strain was eased, but the bigger change was psychological. As Mayo reported, symptoms of melancholy disappeared.
And the turnover rate, that massive 250%.
It almost came to an end. It really looked like they had found a miracle cure for this factory's illness.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because this next part proves that the point isn't just about giving people a break. It's about the process of management.
Right. The success was almost too good to be true at first. Other supervisors in the plant, maybe out of jealousy or maybe just because of pressure for high output, they decided to cancel the rest periods.
They just took them away.
Just took them away, and what happened?
Everything fell apart again.
Instantly. Production plummeted right back to the old miserable levels. All the previous problems, the isolation, the melancholy, they all came rushing back.
So that proved that the solution wasn't just a mechanical thing like adding a 10-minute break. It was something about the permission, the control.
Exactly. So this is where the company president had to step in and apply Mayo's deeper lesson. He ordered the 4 10-minute rest periods back into the schedule for everyone in the department, supervisors included.
But there was a final tweak, the crucial part.
This was the genius move. The part that Mayo knew was essential. The president placed control of the rest periods in the hands of the workers themselves.
Control and consultation. That's the huge shift. They could decide as a group when to start their break within a certain window.
Precisely. The rest periods fixed the physical fatigue, the foot trouble. But giving the workers autonomy, letting them consult and coordinate among themselves, that tiny space for social interaction and self-governance, that's what fixed the social isolation.
And that department finally stabilized.
It did, and Mayo formally used this experiment to challenge the rabble hypothesis. He concluded the problem wasn't laziness. It was, and this is a quote, repetitive work done under conditions of isolation where the social needs of the human being were just completely ignored.
So the textile mill was a huge clinical success, but on a small scale. The next stage of his research, though, is what made him famous, even though he didn't actually start it.
Right. Now we get to the Hawthorne studies at the Western Electric Company in Chicago, starting in 1924.
And it's so important to understand the context here. This first phase, the illumination studies, was started by the National Research Council and the company's management before Mayo was ever involved.
And they were still operating completely within that old, mechanical, Taylorist worldview.
Their hypothesis was as simple as it gets, something any engineer would logically assume: better larding equals more productivity.
A simple, linear, predictable relationship. They set up the classic experiment: 2 groups of female workers.
An experimental group and a control group.
Exactly. In the experimental group, they systematically changed the lighting levels. In the control group, the lighting stayed the same. They were just looking for a direct, measurable correlation between light intensity and output.
But the result they got was, well, it wasn't just unexpected, it was completely baffling. It derailed that entire mechanical view of work. What happened when they actually changed the lighting?
Well, production went up in both groups, regardless of the level of illumination.
Both groups.
Both. When the experimental group got brighter lights, their production went up. But then the control group, where nothing changed, their production went up too. And it gets even more absurd. When the researchers intentionally dimmed the lights in the experimental group,
Let me guess. Output still went up.
it still climbed. It's like running an experiment on gravity and finding that things sometimes just float away because you're watching them.
The researchers must have been completely paralyzed by confusion. They realized the lighting itself was basically irrelevant, but something was definitely influencing behavior.
Totally. So if the lights didn't matter, what else could it be? They just started escalating the experiment, throwing every positive physical and financial change they could think of at this one group.
What kind of things?
They added rest periods, they provided free refreshments like coffee and soup, they shortened the work week, they gave them better ventilation.
And every single time they added one of these positive things, output just kept climbing to new highs.
Exactly, which confirmed their suspicion that the initial conditions weren't optimal. But then they had to test the limits.
And this is the shocking twist, the part that really shattered their whole framework.
It is. They decided to systematically abolish all the new privileges. They took away the rest periods, they got rid of the refreshments, and they sent the workers back to the original long-hour, poor conditions.
So the logic of efficiency would predict a catastrophic drop in output, right? Demoralization, maybe a bunch of people quitting.
Logically, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the paradox that forced the entire field of management to rethink itself. Output dipped for a moment, but then it rebounded. And the final stabilized output, after all the good stuff was removed,
It was higher than ever before.
it rose to a point higher than at any other time during the entire study.
They took away the perks, and the workers worked better than they ever had.
The engineers and the physical scientists, they just hit a wall. Their variables, lighting, fatigue, pay, were demonstrably not the key factors. The whole mechanical view of the worker was just fundamentally wrong.
They had stumbled onto a phenomenon that needed a completely different kind of expert.
And that's the moment the baffled National Research Council swallowed its pride and finally called in George Elton Mayo and his team from Harvard.
Okay, so Mayo steps into this complete paradox. Production spikes when you add privileges, and then it peaks again when you take all those privileges away. He immediately tosses out the engineer's physical explanations, right? The lighting, the soup, the pay.
Throws them right out. He introduces his psychological hypothesis. He looked at the behavior of those test room girls, and he saw what he called a remarkable change in the mental attitude of the group.
They weren't just individual workers anymore.
Not at all. Over the course of the experiment, they realized they were special. They were the focus of all this attention, and they had bonded together into this powerful, cooperative social unit.
And this is how we arrive at the definition of the phenomenon that still bears the factory's name. The Hawthorne effect. How do we define that clearly for everyone listening?
Well, the clearest definition is that the subjects improve their performance or change their behavior primarily because they know they're being observed, analyzed, and considered important. It's not because of the specific thing you're testing.
It's the attention itself.
It is. The test room girls developed this powerful sense of participation. They felt important because for the first time, someone was actually paying attention to them and asking for their opinion.
So the soup and the lighting were just distractions. The real experiment was the attention. Mayo's team then focused on a fifth hypothesis, which turned out to be the central discovery of this whole phase.
Yes, a fundamental change in supervisory techniques.
So the formal, physical, and financial conditions of the work, they were secondary.
Completely secondary. The conditions around the work, the social environment, the quality of the interaction with management, that's what was paramount. This is really the foundation stone of the whole human relations movement.
Let's break down that supervisory change. What was it about the atmosphere that created this intense, high-output social unit, even when they were sent back to tough conditions?
The atmosphere became, as the reports say, relaxed and congenial. Crucially, that old style of supervision, the boss just dictating orders, that was replaced by a supervisor who acted more like a counselor or a friendly administrator.
And the workers could talk freely?
They could talk freely, which eased that social isolation that Mayo had identified way back at the textile mill. The supervisor became a listener, a collaborator, not a dictator.
And that leads to the critical idea of consultation.
The power of consultation. The girls weren't just told what to do anymore. They were consulted and advised about changes, and their views were genuinely listened to and considered. If the researchers wanted to change a rest period, they'd ask the workers first, they'd listen to their objections, and they'd often adjust the plan based on that feedback.
So it wasn't the soup itself. It was the fact that someone cared enough to ask if they liked the soup and if they wanted a break.
Exactly. The process of inclusion, of being made to feel like crucial partners in the experiment, that was the real driver of their success. It validated them as people.
And this leads us to Mayo's big core conclusion from this whole relay assembly test room phase.
That work satisfaction, morale, and productivity depend to a large extent on the informal social pattern of the group. Management needed to shift its focus from the physical layout and the pay packet to building a supportive social structure. The work group itself became the new focus of organizational science.
So the Hawthorne effect gave us the big psychological insight, but Mayo needed to prove this wasn't just a fluke with 6 women in an isolated room. He had to show it applied to the entire factory floor.
Which brings us to phase 2. The massive interviewing program from 1928 to 1931, and the scale of this is just, it's hard to even comprehend.
How many people are we talking about?
They interviewed 21,126 workers. It was an enormous undertaking. And what's revolutionary here is how their methodology changed. They started with a really rigid, structured questionnaire trying to, quantify happiness, but they quickly realized that was just generating useless data.
So they had to change how they talked to the workers.
They made a critical pivot to what we now call non-directive or open-ended interviewing. The interviewer was trained not to interrupt, not to challenge, and not to offer any solutions. Their only job was to listen intently.
To create an environment where the workers felt safe enough to really let off steam.
Exactly. And what did they find about the simple therapeutic act of listening?
It had this massive healing power.
It did. The simple act of venting, of expressing their anxieties and frustrations, of just being heard, it made workers feel significantly better and more positive about their job, even when management made absolutely no material changes to their wages or conditions.
So workers would leave the interview thinking their job had improved just because someone had finally listened to them.
That's the power of it. And this led to a really famous distinction between what Mayo called manifest complaints and latent complaints.
Okay, what's the difference?
The manifest complaint is the objective issue they say out loud. The tools are dull, or I need a pay raise. The latent complaint is the deeper, often hidden psychological issue. It could be rooted in their personal life, their anxieties, their frustration with their social status, a feeling of being alienated.
So a worker who says, my pay is too low, might actually be struggling with feelings of insignificance at home or feeling isolated at work.
Precisely. And if you only address the manifest complaint, you sharpen the tool or give a tiny raise, you often achieve nothing if that deeper, latent psychological need isn't met.
So the interview program really put mental health and personal feelings on the organizational map for the first time.
It absolutely did. It showed management they had to look past the surface and understand the worker's personal equation in relation to the whole organization.
Which brings us to phase 3. The final and maybe the most damning study for the old rabble hypothesis. The bank wiring experiment. This was a bit different.
Very different. It ran from 1931 to 1932. They observed 14 male workers who were wiring telephone banks. And the critical thing is, this was just observation of a regular functioning team in their natural setting, not an isolated test room.
So they were trying to eliminate the Hawthorne effect.
Right. And they used a group incentive pay scheme, which is really important. The idea was simple. If the group as a whole produced more, everyone got paid more.
So if the rabble hypothesis were true, that men are driven purely by self-interest and money, what should have happened here?
They should have been pushing each other relentlessly to maximize their output and maximize their shared income. Management expected them to be working as hard as humanly possible all the time.
But instead, they discovered something else entirely. This powerful, self-regulating mechanism that Mayo called the informal organization.
This was the huge revelation. The group had developed its own unwritten, clear-cut standard for output. And this standard was enforced through social pressure, not by management's rules.
And crucially, this standard was
Significantly lower than management's target. They were deliberately restricting their own output. They were leaving money on the table willingly for the sake of social standing.
It just flies in the face of classical economics. People were actively suppressing their own financial gain to conform to the group.
Let's break down the specific rules this informal group enforced.
They were very clear, and they were enforced rigidly. Rule 1, don't be a rate buster.
Meaning don't work too fast.
Exactly. If you produced too much work, you were making everyone else look bad, you were raising management's expectations, and you were potentially jeopardizing the jobs of slower workers. They'd use social shunning, verbal abuse, or even a practice called binging.
A quick punch to the arm.
A quick, painful punch to the arm to punish anyone who exceeded the group's quota.
Wow. Okay, what was rule 2? Don't be a chesler, the opposite of a rate buster. Don't produce too little work, because then you're seen as a slacker who's dragging the group down and cutting into everyone's shared wages.
Makes sense. What's next?
Don't be a squealer. Group loyalty was absolute. You never, under any circumstances, reported anything bad about a coworker to a supervisor, even if they were cheating the system.
And the final one.
Maintain social distance. Don't act officious or too superior. You stay part of the group no matter what your formal role is supposed to be.
The logic behind these rules is fascinating. The workers were basically protecting themselves from what they saw as management's greed.
That's the core conflict. The fear was that if they showed their true production capacity, management would just raise the production standard without raising their pay. So the group operated under what Mayo called the logic of sentiments.
The logic of sentiments.
A system based on social rules, emotional ties, security, and belonging. Management, on the other hand, was operating under the logic of efficiency, a system based on technical optimization, time standards, and maximum financial output.
And Mayo showed, pretty unequivocally, that the logic of sentiments was the more powerful motivator. The fear of being excluded by your friends was a bigger deal than the chance to earn a few extra dollars.
It was a huge wake-up call. It meant that managers needed sophisticated social skills, the ability to understand and navigate group dynamics and emotional logic, not just technical skills like scheduling and cost analysis.
So moving forward in time, Mayo gets a chance to test these theories in a really high-stakes environment during World War II.
Yes, specifically dealing with chronic absenteeism and turnover in factories making critical aircraft components.
This was a national security problem at that point.
It was. These factories were just hemorrhaging output because their staff was so unstable. So Mayo was called in to study 3 similar factories. 2 of them were in terrible shape, over 70% labor turnover, chronic absenteeism. But the 3rd factory, making the exact same stuff, was doing just fine.
The question was why? What was the secret sauce at the successful factory?
The critical difference was their reward structure. The successful factory used a group wage scheme, but with a very specific high-stakes rule.
Okay.
The group was paid based on their collective output, and if any shift or even any one member failed to meet the target, the entire group's wages were cut for that period.
Whoa. That takes the informal rule from the bank wiring room, the don't be a Chesler rule, and puts real serious financial teeth into it.
It basically weaponizes the logic of sentiments for management's goals. That's a perfect way to put it.
So it forces the workers to form an incredibly strong, proactive group just for their own self-protection.
Exactly. If a worker was absent, they weren't just letting down the company. They were directly costing their friends money. The social pressure to show up and perform became immense.
And what did that look like on the factory floor?
You saw this intense internal self-policing. When a new worker was struggling, the veterans didn't wait for a supervisor to step in. They'd go over, help the struggling worker, train them, and make sure they got up to speed because their own income depended on it.
And this must have created a different kind of leadership.
It did. A natural leader, someone not appointed by management, emerged from within the group. This internal figure, chosen by his peers based on influence and trust, was way more effective at ensuring solidarity, attendance, and performance than any official supervisor could ever be.
And the 2 factories that were failing.
They lacked these strong, self-regulating, informal groups. Their management still treated workers as isolated individuals, and the results were just chaos.
So if you put it all together, from the textile mills' control over rest periods to the bank wiring group's self-regulation, and now this absenteeism study, what's the single most important practical piece of guidance Mayo gave to management?
It was revolutionary at the time. Management should not fear or try to crush these informal groups. They should actively encourage the formation of these strong, cohesive social units. They should recognize their power and treat workers consistently as human beings, but not as cogs in the machine. The group, when you harness it properly, is the most powerful tool you have for organizational stability and output.
Of course, Mayo's influence was profound, but his breakthroughs were met with some really severe criticism, which we have to get into for a balanced view. I mean, when you challenge the status quo, that fundamentally you're going to draw fire.
Oh, absolutely. And it's necessary to engage with these critiques because they show the limitations of the human relations movement. The first and loudest wave of criticism was deeply political. It came straight from organized labor unions.
And the main charge was that Mayo's whole human relations approach was inherently anti-union and pro-management.
That's it. That it was just a manipulative tool disguised as sensitivity.
So the argument was that management was just being taught how to use psychological tricks, listening, consulting, making people feel important as a way to placate workers.
A sophisticated way to keep them compliant and happy enough so they wouldn't organize or demand actual material changes or go on strike for higher wages. If you can keep them focused on their happiness, you distract them from the balance sheet.
The United Auto Workers had that famous cutting phrase for it: Crow sociology.
A very sharp critique. It suggests that management was just building a more comfortable pasture, providing these metaphorical strokes so the herd could be managed more efficiently.
Without having to actually share any greater power or, more importantly, wealth with the workers.
Exactly. So this viewpoint saw Mayo's work not as science, but as a very sophisticated form of labor pacification.
Okay, so that's the political critique.
Yeah.
But his methods were also attacked by other academics, right? Most notably by a guy named Alex Carey, who questioned the scientific validity of the Hawthorne results themselves.
Carey's argument was, in essence, that the entire study was worthless from a statistical and scientific standpoint. He pointed to the incredibly small sample sizes they used to draw these huge conclusions.
We're talking about 5 or 6 girls in that first relay assembly test room.
Right, and Carey argued that's just far too small a sample to generalize across an entire organization, let alone all of human nature.
And Carey even suggested that if you reanalyze the raw data and ignored Mayo's psychological bias, the results actually supported the old view.
He did. He argued the data showed that monetary incentives and strict discipline, not morale, were the real drivers of the output increase. He suggested that the pay-based incentive schemes they put in place before Mayo even showed up were the true cause, and that Mayo just spun the findings psychologically after the fact.
So that's a huge intellectual challenge. Were these legitimate discoveries or just the result of experimental bias and bad statistics?
And that debate still rages today, which just underscores how complex it is to study human behavior in the first place.
We also have Peter Drucker, the famous management theorist, who criticized Mayo from a more strategic angle. What did Drucker feel Mayo was missing?
Drucker argued that Mayo focused too narrowly on interpersonal relations, how people got along with each other, while completely neglecting the actual nature of work itself.
So they were so focused on the social stuff that they forgot the purpose of the factory was production.
That's it. Drucker believed true satisfaction comes from meaningful work and competence, not just from being consulted about the color of the walls. He felt Mayo's work just ignored the broader economic context and the importance of how a task is designed.
That makes a lot of sense. The workers aren't just there to be friends, they're there to make a living and build something useful.
Exactly. And the remaining criticisms get into the ethical and philosophical implications. Mayo's approach was slammed for being dangerously paternalistic.
How so?
Critics worried that by making management responsible for the workers' psychological states, it encouraged this invasive paternalistic domination. It allowed employers to start controlling the private lives and even the private thoughts of their employees, all under the guise of caring for their well-being.
And finally, there's the utopian critique, the idea that Mayo was just ignoring the elephant in the room: conflict.
Critics argued his philosophy was just dangerously naive because it left no place for conflict. In any system that involves labor and capital, conflict is inherent and inevitable.
The goal shouldn't be to get rid of conflict.
Right. It should be to manage that tension constructively, recognizing that the employee and the employer have fundamentally different interests. They also said he had a total lack of awareness of larger social and technological systems. He analyzed the factory floor as if it existed in a vacuum, ignoring recessions, technological change, political pressures.
Okay, so after laying out all of those heavy and frankly very valid criticisms, what is the final balanced evaluation of Mayo's overall contribution?
Well, despite the valid critiques about sample size and ideological bias, his work remains innovative and substantial. It was the first systematic attempt to really study the human dimension in an industrial setting. The Hawthorne studies are, and I think rightly so, regarded as a landmark in administrative thought.
Even Drucker, who was critical, had some praise for it.
He did. Even Drucker admitted that the Hawthorne studies remain the best, the most advanced, and the most complete works in the field of human relations.
So his legacy isn't that he solved everything perfectly, it's that he started asking the right questions at the right time.
That's it exactly. He discovered the informal organization. He proved the profound and overriding effect of the group on worker behavior, showing that social approval and security often trump pure financial incentive.
And most practically.
His work forced management to recognize the critical need for upward communication, the necessity of listening to and acting on the feelings and sentiments of the people on the factory floor. The worker stopped being a replaceable drone and started being a complex source of intelligence and emotional energy.
What an incredible revelation in perspective. We start with this deeply cynical belief that only money can move people, and we end with the realization that production is, at its core, an emotional response of the workers to the work performed.
Yeah, and that response is determined by complex human aspects, by informal groups, and by group dynamics. It's the foundational shift from looking at the individual metric to understanding the team dynamic.
Recognizing that the group's security and its cohesion are the true levers of long-term success.
Absolutely.
So we'll leave you with this final provocative thought based on everything we've unpacked today. If Mayo proved that the logic of sentiments, social cohesion, recognition, feeling valued, is more powerful than the raw logic of efficiency, pay, lighting, strict rules, how much time should modern management really spend optimizing the social structure of a team versus optimizing the technological process?
And where do those two, logic, sentiment, and efficiency, still clash most violently in today's digital workplaces? Especially when you can't use physical peer pressure, like a punch on the arm, to enforce group norms.
Something to think about the next time you see a remote team either exceeding expectations or failing in ways the quarterly reports just can't explain.
It's a great question.
That's it for this Deep Dive. I'll see you next time.